Thank you all for coming today. For some reason, January the 25th has been a day selected for at least 11 different events I'm aware of. And about more than half of them are environmental at the same time. So people are cleaning beaches and hearing about climate change and basically having a good time in other counties. So I really appreciate you all coming out to hear this important information. This is the 5th State of the Bay. The Estero Bay Agency on Bay Management does one of these every 5 years. And what we're going to do is talk about the parameters that we examine. I want to point out that every piece of information we use in the State of Bay is publicly available. You can find it online or in documents. You can do the analysis yourself if you want to take a look at these things. The availability has varied. We found some of the information that we used to be able to depend upon no longer easy to get to. They're behind paywalls now, for example, on some of the sociological issues. I'm going to move over to here so I can speak while I can see a monitor, and I will proceed there from there. Now, the State of the Bay has these components: an introduction to the principles of the Agency on Bay Management, the human history within Estero Bay. I do the prehistoric history if they'd let me. Water quality, hydrology, wildlife, social issues, and then finally discussion and conclusions. Here are the major points from this cycle State of the Bay. Hurricane Irma had a substantial effect on water quality parameters as it flooded the Estero Bay watershed. That signature is very clear in things like nutrients and the fresh water going into the bay. There are multiple increases in a number of impaired estuarine water body segments for fecal coliform and nitrogen since the last 5 years. Just to point out, in 2009 to 2013, we were seeing improvements in almost all of the parameters for Estero Bay except for a few spots of nitrogen and one location for fecal coliform. That has begun to reverse. Spring Creek is now designated as impaired for copper. I consider this a particular triumph because we were having trouble getting copper designated as a water quality problem because it was preempted by the state for the Department of Agriculture, and we weren't supposedly allowed to talk about copper pollution, which comes principally from the use of algicides and fungicides. Those folks that like to make the ponds and communities look sort of aquamarine to kill the algae? That's one of the main sources of the copper sulfate in that watershed. Dissolved oxygen is slightly declining in both fresh and estuarine waters in association with nutrients and warmer temperatures. So as we're getting a warmer world, it's going to be harder to keep dissolved oxygen in the waters. But I want to point out that most of our tributaries always had low dissolved oxygen for parts of the year when they had much slower stream flows and water temperatures could be high. There's been significant areas of improvement in water quality associated principally with the adoption and implementation of our stricter local government fertilizer ordinances and construction of filter marshes in the headwater tributaries, leading to nutrient reduction principally in some of the base subsegments of phosphorus and chlorophyll A. So it's reduced the phosphorus and kept it low since these have been adopted, and chlorophyll A is much less higher in the tributaries. Turbidity remains low throughout the system. There have been increases in the acres of conservation lands, principally in 2017, and increases in colonial bird nesting. This is the 2013 impairments, and the red's the ones you want to pay attention to. And you can see we had problems in 6 Mile Cypress, Mullet Creek, and Imperial River. And the verified impairments by 2010, which prior to this 2013, you can see with all the V's. So the number of impairments have gone down in that time period. But these are impairments today, and you can see there's been a big shift from the freshwater to estuarine. And the major areas of impairment are fecal coliform and total nitrogen, and the copper that I mentioned in the Spring Creek watershed. One problem is Mullet Creek continues to be a problem in fecal coliform and has been for most of the states of the bays we looked at. This is a calmer way to look at. This is the type of slide I'll show to decision makers, because when you show them slides with red in them, they get excited. This is a map of the impairments for the watershed of all put together. It's put together by DEP. And you can see there's also mercury impairments, but that's a statewide problem associated with a lot of sources typically outside of our watershed coming in from atmospheric issues. You can see dissolved oxygen will remain low in the tributary systems at time. Fecal coliform in brown is a rather significant problem throughout the watershed to some extent. Now, the data we take for water quality comparisons comes from the surface water monitoring sites, and give great credit to the Lee County Environmental Lab for providing the information we find the most useful. It's consistent in sites year after year after year. So between 2014, 2016, and you notice it cuts off at 2016 because they stopped collecting after that, the annual chlorophyll A increased by about 56%. And this is in estuarine systems. And the peak monthly chlorophyll increased for an average of 97%. To understand this graph, the darker green is the average, and the light green is the highest that parameter ever went in that year. So you basically see, though, that at the same time that was happening on average throughout the watershed, chlorophyll A dropped in Estero Bay proper, in the estuarine bay. Decrease of 61%. It still meant that Spring Creek and Hendry Creek had means that exceeded all of the recommended chlorophyll standards. In freshwater systems, there was an increase, but that was only about 8% by comparison in chlorophyll A. And this reflects, I think, the fertilizer ordinance benefits. Now, some people say, well, it's still increased. Well, it's a lot less of an increase than it would have been if we hadn't been restricting the nutrients. And peaks tend to come in January and in May. It probably represents the dry season stagnation when the water's just sitting in these tributaries and gets concentrated and you get a bloom then. Or there is a spring first flush event when we move from dry season to wet season, and that is a normal thing in an estuary. Dissolved oxygen between 2014 and 2019 decreased about 5.4%. That's a small decrease, but it's trending downward. And the monthly minimum dissolved oxygen decreased about 7.8%, so the minimums are getting lower. By the way, all of this will be posted online for the Cela Tega and also at the website for the Agency on Bay Management if you want to get a good look at it and contemplate it. In the freshwater systems between 2014 and 2019, dissolved oxygen increased 5.8%. And the maximums also increased. So the tributaries got a little more oxygen in them. Fecal coliform increased in all estuarine segments but two. And part of that is because they were already high in Mullet Creek and the Estero River. But the average increase was negligible. It didn't even make a 1%. The peak month fecal coliform also increased in all segments but two, Estero River and Spring Creek. Between 2014 and 2019, the fecal coliform decreased in some freshwater segments, except again, Mullet Creek and now Spring Creek. And then peak fecal coliform increased in half of the freshwater segments, including Mullet Creek, Spring Creek, and Imperial River. Total nitrogen increased in all the estuarine segments. And this is very different than what we saw in the prior 5-year period. But the geometric means still do not exceed the average standard for nitrogen yet. The average increase was 44%. The peak monthly nitrogen decrease in all estuarine segment about 30.6%. So while the average is getting higher, the peaks are getting a bit lower. But the most common peak is in September. Between 2014 and 2019, the total nitrogen decreased in 10-mile keel canal, which is good. And I think part of it involves the restoration of part of the crew in the keel canal situation. It increased in Mullet Creek, Estero River, Oak Creek, and Lightner Creek. So the watershed-wise, the average increase was about 3%. Decline in total nitrogen occurred between 2012 and 2016, but then Hurricane Irma flooding flows increased it. And by then it began to decline again, but it will take more years to see if it's a trend. So think of it this way. When the entire watershed floods in a storm event that actually exceeded the estimated 500-year storm, and everything on the landscape has got water standing on it, and it's dissolving everything that's in everybody's garden shed, everybody's lawn, every golf course, every median, every place is underwater, and then that water drains into the tributaries in the bay. That is a massive dose of nitrogen to the system. And this is to be expected as we get more hurricanes like this. Total phosphorus in all the estuaries was achieved. And the total phosphorus, while is increasing in all the segments except Estero Bay, the increase is not substantial relative to the standard. And you can see how, if you look at the Estero Bay, where it used to peak very high in the year 2000, we've now brought that total phosphorus down relatively low. And the same is true within the riverine systems. But we do have, and we have a reduction here of about 20% over this time period. So as some of our speakers will probably tell us, it's easy to get at phosphorus with different treatment systems. It's very hard to get at nitrogen, because you can have nitrogen entered into your system from the atmosphere and from organisms that fix it from the atmosphere. Salinity's been relatively stable in the bay, although there's really some big changes in hurricane years. So the lowest year was in 2005, and the highest in 2007. In the 2009 to 2019, it dropped by less than 1%, and the peak decreased about 1.8%. Turbidity is increased substantially in several water bodies, and is now getting close, as you can see, at the peaks to the 29 NTU standard for peak events in places like the estuary and Hendry Creek. It varied in the various freshwater systems with an average increase of about 4.9%. The peak monthly turbidities also increased. So let's take a look at how the water flows within our tributaries. 10 Mile Canal, point out, look at that period toward the end of 2017, that's Irma. Very clear signature there in 10 Mile Canal. And you can see the annual cycle of wet and dry seasons. Again, 6 Mile Cypress, Irma peak. Estero River, both branches, North Branch and South Branch. The North Branch shows a very strong Irma peak. The South Branch is always kind of following a strong flood drown cycle, but it doesn't peak as high in terms of some of the parameters. Just doesn't carry as much flow. And there is the Bonita Springs. As the folks in Bonita Springs know, that's that big flooding event shown there in the 2017. So all of our hydrographs for our tributaries match up very closely in this cycle. That wasn't always true in previous State of the Bay years. The Imperial River at Bonita Springs has a rather different cycle, and in part this is because of something that was identified when we were looking at flood reduction for the Imperial River. Today, the Imperial River is not asked to carry just the flows of the Imperial River watershed. It's asked to carry the flows of several other watersheds which have been diverted to it. So it carries part of the water of the Cocohatchee, water from Spring Creek, water that comes from Estero River, and some of the flows that are from further even on to the east within the Crew areas. So that hydrograph is a very high one almost every year. Bald eagle nesting within the Estero Bay watershed has declined from its historic records. Old carrying capacity was somewhere around 12 nests for the whole watershed. We're down, moving somewhere between 7 and 3, depending on the year. Eagle nest monitoring is also more spotty. because of the way they changed the monitoring cycles, and also since it was delisted as an endangered species. So they're not keeping as much, the data that's available on nesting. And nesting success data is not reported in the same way. However, we do have a benefit of increased colonial nesting birds, and there's excellent data. I thank the aquatic preserve staff who puts this data together, and they gave me everything I needed plus more. And so this is all summarized for you. They're doing well. There's some shifts in species, but generally everything you'd expect to see is showing up. And through time, we can expect some new species to show up. It'll be interesting to see if we get a shift northward of frigate bird nesting into Estero Bay. And when that happens, we may see a very interesting change in colonial bird nesting, because frigate birds can do havoc on the other birds that nest. Seagrasses have increased within the Estero Bay watershed over the years that we've been tracking it, and this data comes from the CHNEP. And you can see that we've moved from the 50s, about 6,000, to 2014 of 10,000 acres of seagrasses with Estero Bay. And the San Carlos Bay segment I include because part of what we consider Estero Bay and Matanzas Pass is included in that San Carlos Bay segment. The apparently the south region of our area is not getting as regular seagrass monitoring as it used to. And I wasn't able to find any data available to the public after 2014. So it would really be good if we could have another cycle to look at what's happened to seagrasses in all of our estuarine waters of Lee County, particularly after our years of algae blooms and heavy flooding. Commercial fish landings have remained low from where they used to be. And you know, back in the day, we're looking here both at fish that are taken by line, things are taken by trap, and things that were taken by net. And you can see sea trouts are way down. Blue crabs have begun to bounce back from the bad hurricane year, and years, I should say, and mullet landings stay down, in part because of gear and level of effort. It's a lot harder to catch mullet when you're not using gill nets. Acres of conservation land increased significantly, principally in 2017 because of the acquisition of a long-term project that I worked on for a long part of my life. First proposed back in the year, 2000, actually put together the idea in 1998. I'm sorry, in the year 1990, first started. 1988. So in 1988, first came up with this idea as part of a wildlife corridor plan, which was utilized by Lee, put together, and I submitted to Lee County, and Lee County used in 1990 for the acquisition of land in a coherent land acquisition pattern. And so here's our 2014. And one thing we did in this interim is at the Regional Planning Council, we mapped all of the conservation easements in the whole state of Florida. So they're very small. When you look on a big map, you don't see them very, here's one just for the Spring Creek Basin. And you can see they can make up substantial segments and interconnect streams, creeks, and so forth. And we try to run them along creek corridors when that's available. So put all together, this is from Conservation 2020, we have substantial increase today in conservation lands, principally because of one major acquisition in the Estero Bay watershed, and that was Edison Farms. And so, you know, we worked many, many years, decades, towards this acquisition. It's been a project of the Estero Bay Agency on Bay Management for those years, and the acquisition of this is a major triumph for your watershed. And it's really going to help Halfway Creek and ultimately the Estero River in having these headwaters protected. So, what is the source of a lot of these problems? It's increased population, increased impervious surface, increased use by humans of these constituents on the landscape, which end up in the watershed, which end up in the waters, which end up in our examination. And there's no likelihood that this will decrease to any substantial amount, at least until sea level rise catches up. As you can see in the 2000 census, there were about 145,000 within the Estero Bay watershed. By 2010, it was 195,000. And then in 2018, it's estimated to 248,000. As we pointed out in the previous State of the Bay, the economic downturn, 2008, 2009, it really didn't hit the Estero Bay watershed. And so we've had a 41.5% increase in the number of people in the watershed. And think of the concomitant increase in impervious surface and landscape changes and loss of filtering functions of wetlands and the application of chemicals. So we do have solutions, and one that's going to be recommended in the State of the Bay is nutrient pollution source reduction at the source. And this is the simplest way to do it. It's the most cost-effective way to do it. It's much more expensive, much more difficult to try to treat it once it's in the water body. And we also have other documents available that have solutions within them to some of the problems within the Estero Bay watershed. We've got the watershed restoration and flood reduction plan for the city of Bonita Springs, which some of it's already been implemented and some of it's being implemented. And the city of Bonita Springs is very progressive in its actions towards dealing with these issues. We have a Spring Creek restoration plan. Some of that's been implemented, but fully implemented, it could bring Spring Creek back to much better water quality, habitat, and hydrology. There's been a Lee County climate change resiliency strategy since 2010. And they had begun implementing it, and they did some good things and actually saved themselves a lot of money in terms of energy production and expenses and other factors. But then it was no longer, I should say, it was shelved, and it could very easily, if people chose to, be started up again. And then we also have a improved mitigation management plan, which shows you where we could do the land acquisitions to have the best effect in terms of improving water quality, hydrology, and habitat. So that is a brief summary of a long document, the State of the Bay 2019. It was funded by the city of Bonita Springs, and we really thank them for having the resources to be able to produce this document. And the Regional Planning Council did in-kind contributions in terms of staff time and effort to get this document done. I want to thank all the entities that make the public information available and all the people who provided data to me so I could produce this product. And I have a little time, I think, for a few questions. Thank you very much.
Jim.
Did you want to come?
Yes, sir.
My name is Walter Corbin. I was just wondering what research is being done, especially on these golf courses, relative to substituting for harmful pesticides, fungicides, and fertilizers. In other words, that's a big part of the tourist industry, having a golf course, but it's also very consequential in polluting streams and rivers. And I just wondered, you just can't stop it, but maybe there's some research being done to mitigate at least some of that damage.
There has been research done in the past on how to do a golf course better. And some of the golf courses here utilize it and others do not. There was good work done on Sanibel, looking at reducing the discharges from golf courses there. There are this thing called Audubon certified golf courses, which go partway there. They're not as far as they should be, but they go partway there. Certainly more could be done, particularly in terms of alternate vegetation. One of the projects I was very proud to work on many years ago was with the Bonita Bay development, where we looked at alternative grasses that didn't need to be fertilized, and salt-tolerant grasses at some of the areas where you're getting next to an estuary that could handle the natural salty situation and didn't need to be dealt with. So there's a lot of things that could be done. It would be good to have more, and it would be good to have more specifically in Southwest Florida, because often when you go to the scientific literature, it's done in some other part of the country.
Jim, would you care to speculate on what impacts will happen with the changes to the interpretation of water in the U.S.?
That is, if they all go through, that is a major loss to Florida, this new proposal. It's actually an old proposal. I had to fight this off back when Dan Quayle was vice president, when I was with another agency, and they came and said, well, this is our new definition for wetlands. And I said, well, that's going to eliminate about half the wetlands in the state of Florida. This one will do the same thing. What it will do is it'll get rid of short hydroperiod wetlands. So things that are hydric/pine flatwoods, wet prairies, the substantial marsh areas, which are wet for part of the year, but not the other part of the year, will definitely be negatively impacted. What I did with the congressional team that came to visit with me at that time is I said, okay, we got your definition, let's follow your definition. They were dressed up. They were in their suits. The ladies were in high heels and fancy dresses. And I walked them into an area they were defining as dry ground, up to about 3 feet of water. And they got the point. And that is that's what needs to be done. But no, the people who are writing the rule today, they're not even looking at what the consequences are in reality. And the fact of the matter is, like they said, I spent, I guess it's 36 years professionally employed, 48 years doing this type of work since I was a teenager in the Mundy Group getting 6 Mile Cypress bought. It takes decades to get rules in, but just takes a year to get a rule eliminated. So you really have to defend this, and I hope we can get back to the sensible, scientifically based decision-making that I've experienced when I had governors like Bob Graham.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Suzanne Frechette. I'm a volunteer at 6 Mile Cypress Slough. I've been interested in the point that the gentleman brought up about herbicides as well as pesticides, fertilizers, and fungicides. And it seems that most of the research has been overlooking the effect of herbicides, especially glyphosate, and glyphosate's impact on the development of cyanobacteria. And I'm wondering if there's any testing that is projected or that will go on to test for especially glyphosate, a specific, as well as other herbicides. One of the things that I see in the numbers is that many times surface water runoff is attached to the development or the evidence of nitrates. And I think you would find as well phosphates and especially glyphosate in those test samples as well.
That's a complex question because looking for glyphosate is different than looking for total phosphate. And quite frankly, we use total nitrogen, total phosphorus because that's available. The human signature in nitrogen pollutions is nitrates, nitrites, and ammonia. And those would be much better parameters to spend our time with regard to nitrogen pollution. Glyphosate is more than just the total phosphate, and it's much harder to sample. And I don't see regularly people doing that work in our region. People doing the research in water chemistry here at the college and at other places might be able to better answer your question than I.
And some of them will be speaking later on. We have time for one more question for Jim.
Is this working? I don't know how to use a microphone.
That's not
I'm from
your
the other side of the
expertise.
state. On the wetlands, are any of your local governments looking at adopting their own wetland protection for development?
We had ordinances for wetland protection. In fact, Lee County was once the first in the state for mangrove protection, and they were all subsequently preempted. So the level of wetland protection that our local governments used to employ is now mostly in the form of their land use decisions. And there's been a cyclical pattern for our region. We've had periods of great levels of protection and periods where it's in decline. And the curve has not gone up again in any recent time.
Jim, I thank you. We should all thank you